The production team for This Is Tom Jones had booked many difficult guests over the course of the show's run. They had learned, through experience, how to manage the particular difficulties that came with performers who were too large for the format's standard operating procedures. Performers who did not naturally work within the 45-minute structure of a variety program, who did not respond well to direction, who had their own understanding of what a stage was for that did not necessarily align with the producer's schedule for the evening. They had managed Janis Joplin, who brought her own world with her wherever she went. They had worked around the specific protocols that Aretha Franklin's professionalism required. They had adapted to the particular needs of performers who were, in their different ways, bigger than the format they were appearing in. Each time, the show had absorbed the difficulty and produced something that worked. They thought they were prepared. They were not prepared for Jerry Lee Lewis. Nothing was ever fully prepared for Jerry Lee Lewis. This was not a failure of preparation. It was a structural impossibility. Jerry Lee Lewis was not a person who could be adequately prepared for, in the way that weather systems in extreme latitudes cannot be adequately prepared for, not because they are unreasonably difficult, but because they operate according to their own principles, and those principles do not consult the plans of the people in their path. Jerry Lee Lewis arrived at the studio with the specific quality of presence that had defined him since he had first sat down at a piano in a Sun Records session in Memphis in 1956. He was not loud in the way that some performers were loud, performatively, for effect. He was loud in the way of something that has no other mode. The energy that moved through him did not have an off position. He did not walk into a room. He occupied it. Every room he had ever entered had been altered by his presence in it, and the ABC television studio in Los Angeles was not going to be an exception. The show itself was, in 1969, one of the most watched programs on American television. Its format was simple in design and complex in execution. Tom Jones at the center, a series of guests from the widest possible range of the musical world, and 45 minutes of live performance that was supposed to follow a schedule. The schedule was important. Broadcasting had rules. The floor manager had a clipboard. The sound engineers had levels to set, and the camera operators had shots to line up, and the whole machinery of a major television production had its own requirements that were, in theory, non-negotiable. Theory and Jerry Lee Lewis had a complicated relationship. Tom Jones had been told by the producers that the day would require careful management. There had been advanced conversations about the running order, about the format, about how to structure the shared time between two performers who both occupied the center of any stage they stood on and had no natural tendency toward the periphery. The producers had plans. They had contingencies. They had a floor manager who was very experienced and who had, over the course of the show's run, become expert at guiding strong personalities through the requirements of live television. Tom had listened to all of this with the patient attention of a man who understood that the producers needed to make the plan, and that the plan was going to be what it was going to be, and that the evening was going to be what the evening was going to be, and that those two things were not necessarily the same thing. He had run enough of these sessions to understand the difference between the schedule on the clipboard and the show that actually happened, and he had come to value the distance between those two things rather than trying to eliminate it. Jerry Lee Lewis looked at the piano that had been set up on stage. He sat down at it. He began to play. He did not check the running order. He did not consult the floor manager's schedule. He did not ask Tom Jones whether this was the right moment. He played because there was a piano, and he was in the same room as a piano, and that was the entire chain of causation required. Tom Jones stood at the side of the stage and watched. There was a moment in the playing, somewhere in the first 60 seconds, before the arrangement had been established and before the band had fully understood what was being required of them, when the room made its decision. The decision was that the schedule no longer applied, that the floor manager's clipboard was a historical artifact, that what was happening at the piano was the only thing that was happening, and that everything else in the studio was now organized around it. Tom recognized the moment the way he recognized all moments of this kind, not as an observer, but as someone who had felt the same thing himself, from the inside, and who knew what it looked like when it was happening to someone else. Jerry Lee Lewis at a piano was not a performance of abandon. It was abandon itself. It was the thing in its pure form, without the layer of calculation that even the most committed performers maintained between themselves and the audience. The two of them ended up on stage together. The producers had planned it that way, and it happened, but the shape it took was not the shape the producers had planned. What it took instead was the shape of two performers who were both, in their different ways, constitutionally incapable of performing below capacity, and who had been placed in the same room and given instruments and asked to do what they did. What they did was extraordinary in the specific, complicated sense of something that cannot be reproduced in controlled conditions because it requires a specific kind of chaos as its raw material. Jerry Lee's chaotic energy and Tom's directional force meeting on a stage together produced something that the musicians behind them had to work to keep up with, and that the studio audience received with the quality of attention that people give to things that are demonstrably happening rather than being performed. The floor manager had long since given up on the schedule. Tom Jones understood this immediately. He had understood it before Jerry Lee walked through the door, because Tom Jones had been paying attention to Jerry Lee Lewis since before Tom Jones had a career, since before Gordon Mills, and since before It's Not Unusual, and since before the first time anyone had offered him a microphone that was not in a working men's club in a South Wales Valley town. The music of Jerry Lee Lewis had reached him in that specific context through whatever combination of radio signals and borrowed records and the particular receptivity of a young man who was not yet a performer, but who was already listening, already paying the specific quality of attention to voices that would define his entire professional life. Back in the working men's clubs of South Wales, before It's Not Unusual, before Las Vegas, before the television program, back when Tom was a young man with a voice and an instinct, and no particular roadmap for what to do with either, Jerry Lee Lewis had been one of the sounds that had told him what a voice could do when a performer was willing to take the full risk of the room. The wildness, the commitment, the piano being played as if it were an act of personal confrontation with everyone present. These things had mattered to Tom in ways that his own career, by 1969, had moved in directions that did not always make visible. When Jerry Lee walked through the door, Tom was not a host greeting a guest. He was a man meeting someone who had, in a very specific way, helped make him what he was. Jerry Lee Lewis, in 1969, was in the middle of one of the more remarkable second acts in the history of popular music. The 1950s had made him famous. Whole lot of shakin' going on in 1957. Great Balls of Fire in 1957. The piano playing, the hair, the absolute certainty of a performer who had decided that modesty was not a useful performance tool and had never reconsidered. He had been one of the founding forces of rock and roll, one of the actual inventors, in the specific technical and cultural sense, of what rock and roll was and what it could do. And then the career had nearly ended. The marriage to his 13-year-old cousin in 1958 had produced a scandal that had removed him from mainstream pop radio with a completeness that would have finished most careers permanently. He had spent the following decade working in country music, playing the kind of rooms that were smaller than the rooms his talent had earned, and smaller than the rooms he had been used to. Continuing because continuing was what he did, and because the piano was the thing he did, and there was no version of Jerry Lee Lewis that did not play the piano. By 1969, the country recordings had brought him back to a level of visibility that the pop world had not expected. He was not the same kind of star he had been in 1957. He was something more complicated than that. A figure who had survived his own catastrophe and was still, unmistakably, one of the most electrically present performers alive. That was what walked into the ABC studio. Afterward, the producers were certain of one thing. It had worked. What it was exactly remained harder to define. It was two men on a stage. It was two specific forces, two specific philosophies of what a performance required and what a performer owed an audience, occupying the same space and discovering that the philosophies were not as different as they appeared from the outside. Both of them operated on the principle of total commitment. Both of them had decided, somewhere early in their lives, that the only acceptable version of a performance was the one that used everything available. The methods were different. The routes that had brought them to this stage were different. The fundamental agreement about what a stage was for was the same. Tom Jones spoke about Jerry Lee Lewis with a specific kind of warmth that was different from the warmth he extended to most subjects. More unguarded, more personal. The warmth of someone describing a debt that could not be fully repaid. The debt was old, older than It's Not Unusual, older than Las Vegas. It went back to the working men's clubs and the record players and the young man in South Wales who had heard someone play piano like a personal confrontation with the entire audience and had understood, for the first time, what that level of commitment to a room sounded like. That young man had grown up and built a career and become a television host and put Jerry Lee Lewis on his show. And Jerry Lee Lewis had walked in and sat down at the piano and played, and the room had made its decision, and the floor manager had put his clipboard down. The television program that the producers had planned had not survived contact with Jerry Lee Lewis. Something better had replaced it, something that could not have been scheduled because it required the specific unpredictability of a performer who did not operate according to schedules, placed in the specific company of a host who understood what that unpredictability contained. Tom Jones's greatest gift as a broadcaster was not his ability to control a program. It was his ability to recognize when the most interesting thing was the thing he had not planned, and to let it be that instead of what the clipboard said. And when Jerry Lee Lewis walked through his studio door and sat down at his piano without asking permission, Tom Jones recognized what was happening and did not interfere with it. The room changed. The schedule ended. The music took over. That had always been the plan. It had just never been written down on any clipboard in that studio. Because some plans cannot be written down. They can only be recognized in real time by the people who have been paying close enough attention to see them when they arrive. Some meetings between performers are professional courtesies. Some are recognitions. This one was a recognition. Two men who had independently arrived at the same conclusion about what the job required, from opposite directions and through entirely different lives, discovering in each other's presence that the conclusion had always been correct, and that a stage with a piano in it was all the proof either of them had ever needed.